It was one of those evenings in early September when St. Mary Mead seemed caught between seasons, summer's brightness lingering, yet the faintest hint of autumn crisping the air. The village, small and self-contained as ever, glowed faintly gold in the fading light. Bees hummed lazily around the last of the lavender. The air was heavy with ripening apples, and the church bell marked 6 o'clock with a soft, reflective melancholy. Before we begin, tell us, where are you listening from tonight? Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling Miss Marple mysteries and stay with us till the very end. The truth always hides in the quietest corners. At the edge of the village, beyond the post office and Miss Hartnell's rather militant garden, lay the orchard belonging to Colonel and Mrs. Frobisher. It was a broad and orderly place, every tree pruned and tended with military precision. The Colonel took great pride in his apples, Bramleys, Pippins, Russets, and spoke of them as if they were soldiers under his command. His annual apple tea, as it was known locally, was a social event to which nearly everyone in St. Mary Mead was invited, whether they liked apples or not. That afternoon, the tea had gone much as it always did. There was lemonade for the young, cider for the bold, and the Colonel's wife, a delicate, bird-like woman with a voice that trembled as if she were forever on the verge of some apology, had presided with thin smiles and shaking hands. Mrs. Frobisher's nerves, it was well known, were not what they had been since the war. Miss Marple had attended, of course. One could not live in St. Mary Mead and not attend the apple tea, unless one wished to give rise to talk. She had sat under the spreading branches of an old apple tree, knitting something indeterminate and pale blue, while listening to the hum of conversation around her. There was Major Pickering boasting of his new motor car, Mrs. Bantry declaring that apples gave her indigestion, and Mr. Pritchard, the new vicar, who was far too earnest for his own good, trying to engage Mrs. Frobisher in conversation about parish finances. All quite ordinary, quite village-like. And yet Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that wickedness seldom arrived with warning, felt something unsettled in the air that evening. It was nothing she could have put into words. Perhaps the way Mrs. Frobisher kept glancing toward the orchard's far end, where the ground dipped near the old stone wall. Or the way Colonel Frobisher's voice, usually so jovial, carried a tightness, a forced cheer that rang false. By 6:30, the guests had begun to drift homeward. Trays were cleared, teacups stacked, and Mrs. Frobisher, pale and fluttering, had retired early with murmurs of a headache. The Colonel, still in the orchard, was last seen locking the gate, his hat in one hand, a small basket of apples in the other. That was the last anyone saw of him alive. The discovery came the next morning, just after dawn. Young Tommy Briggs, the postman's boy, had been taking the shortcut through the orchard when he noticed something pale among the roots of the great apple tree, the same one beneath which Miss Marple had sat. He thought at first it was a sack. Then he saw the hand. By the time Constable Sims arrived, word had already spread like spilled milk. St. Mary Mead was buzzing with speculation before breakfast. Mrs. Bantry was certain it was burglars, though why burglars should murder a retired colonel and leave his watch and wallet untouched was a mystery to her. Mr. Pritchard muttered something about divine retribution for the colonel's lack of faith. Miss Hartnell suggested poison apples and had promptly stopped eating her morning apple tart. Miss Marple said very little. She had been out early herself, collecting flowers for her breakfast table, and when she heard the news from Mrs. Price Ridley, she set her basket down, sighed softly, and murmured, "Ah, dear. It begins again, doesn't it?" No one heard her, but she stood a long moment in the garden looking toward the distant orchard, where the first curious villagers were already gathering, like crows to a bright thing, and her eyes were thoughtful. She had known somehow that something would come of that uneasy air beneath the apple tree, and when, later that morning, she learned that Colonel Frobisher had died not from a blow or fall, but from something quite invisible and silent, she simply nodded once, as if it confirmed what she had already suspected. By mid-morning, St. Mary Mead was alive with the sort of restless energy that only tragedy can produce. Curtains twitched, kettles whistled unattended, and conversations began, innocently enough, with, "Have you heard?" but rarely ended without accusation. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to announce quite definitively that Colonel Frobisher had been poisoned. She said this as she stood outside the grocer's, one gloved hand on her bicycle, her eyes glinting with dreadful satisfaction. "Cyanide, I shouldn't wonder," she declared, though she had not the faintest notion what cyanide was. "You could smell almonds, you know. Well, at least Mrs. Bantry says you could, and she's got a very sharp nose for that sort of thing." By the time Miss Hartnell cycled past, the story had grown arms and legs. According to her, the colonel had been seen quarreling only the day before with a suspicious stranger near the railway station, though later it transpired the stranger had been the fishmonger's nephew. At the vicarage, Mr. Pritchard knelt in prayer for the soul of one who perhaps departed this world unprepared, though his wife privately wondered if he wasn't also hoping for a mention in the local paper. Meanwhile, Mrs. Frobisher had shut herself up in her room and refused to see anyone, even the doctor. The constable, a stout and good-natured man named Sims, did his best to appear professional. He had roped off the orchard, taken down a list of the previous day's guests, and spoken solemnly about keeping an open mind. But as everyone in St. Mary Mead knew, Sims's mind was not particularly roomy to begin with. He suspected the gardener, George Flint, a quiet, stooping man who had worked for the Frobishers since before the war, simply because he was poor and had the look of one who might do mischief. Miss Marple, for her part, sat that afternoon by her window with her knitting, watching the trickle of villagers passing by the orchard gate. Her nephew, the novelist Raymond West, often teased her for knowing everything that went on in the village, to which she always replied, "My dear Raymond, people are very much the same everywhere. Only in small places they're easier to observe." As she watched, she noticed Mrs. Bantry hurry past with a basket of flowers, white chrysanthemums of all things, funereal and far too early to be appropriate. Then a few minutes later came George Flint himself, trudging along the lane, his cap in hand. He paused near the gate as if uncertain whether to go in, then turned away. That hesitation, Miss Marple thought, was interesting. A guilty man would not hesitate. A frightened one would. Later that afternoon, a knock came at her door. It was Constable Sims, red-faced and sweating. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but the inspector from Melchester's come down. Inspector Lacey. He's asking everyone who was at the tea yesterday to come to the house for a few questions. Thought I'd best tell you." "Very kind of you, Mr. Sims," said Miss Marple, smiling. "One should always be helpful in these matters. I'll come directly." She tidied her knitting away, adjusted her hat, and took her umbrella, though there was not a cloud in the sky. She had no particular expectation of being helpful to Inspector Lacey, who was an energetic man of action, not observation, but it was always useful, she found, to listen carefully when people began explaining themselves. The Frobisher drawing room smelled faintly of apples and lavender polish. Mrs. Frobisher was not present. The inspector had said she was unfit for questioning. Around the room sat the other guests of the apple tea. Mrs. Bantry, flushed and self-important, Major Pickering, puffing his pipe, the vicar, grave and nervous, and George Flint, who stood awkwardly near the door, his cap twisting in his hands. Inspector Lacey was brisk, the sort of man who prided himself on efficiency. "We've reason to believe the colonel's death was not natural," he began. "The doctors found traces of digitalis in his teacup, enough to kill a man of his age and condition." There was a collective gasp. Mrs. Bantry clutched her pearls. The vicar murmured something about the wages of sin. "Now," said the inspector, "who poured the colonel's tea?" A pause. Then hesitantly Mrs. Bantry said, "Why, Mrs. Frobisher did. I saw her myself." She took the cup straight to him. The vicar nodded. "Quite right. She was the only one who handled it." All eyes turned toward the empty chair where Mrs. Frobisher might have sat. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap. "Digitalis, you said?" she asked mildly. "That's rather a curious choice, isn't it, Inspector? One wouldn't expect it lying about in a household unless someone was, perhaps being treated for the heart?" The inspector frowned. "That's so, yes. The colonel had a bottle of it among his medicines, but we'll be checking whether the dosage was tampered with." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "I do hope poor Mrs. Frobisher's heart is strong enough to bear the strain. Though, of course," she added with apparent absent-mindedness, "I shouldn't think hers was the only heart in the village giving trouble lately." The inspector looked puzzled. Mrs. Bantry looked delighted. "You don't mean romance, Miss Marple?" she whispered eagerly. But Miss Marple only smiled her gentle, knowing smile. "My dear Mrs. Bantry," she said, "romance and murder are very often much closer relations than people suppose." The next morning dawned overcast and heavy, with the promise of rain. A thin mist clung to the hedgerows and blurred the neat cottages of St. Mary Mead into soft shapes. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of day that suited secrets. Quiet, dull, and gray enough for things to go unnoticed. She rose early, as she always did, made her tea and opened her kitchen window to let in the damp, apple-scented air. From her vantage point, she could just see the Frobishers' orchard across the fields. There was a policeman stationed at the gate now, looking bored and a little wet. The scene, for all its grimness, had already become part of village life, something to be discussed alongside milk deliveries and the weather. But Miss Marple was thinking not of gossip, but of people, of Mrs. Frobisher's trembling hands, of George Flint's hesitation, of the way Major Pickering had spoken just a little too quickly when the inspector mentioned poisons. She knew, from long experience, that people's first reactions were rarely accidental. At mid-morning, she paid a social call to the vicarage. The Reverend Pritchard's wife, a gentle and rather anxious woman named Alice, welcomed her warmly, if distractedly. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful, simply dreadful," she said, pouring tea with a shaking hand. "To think of such a thing happening here in St. Mary Mead. And poor Mrs. Frobisher, she must be quite beside herself." Miss Marple nodded, accepting her cup. "Indeed. One forgets how very fragile domestic happiness can be. I always say, a house can look perfectly in order and yet be entirely unsettled inside." Mrs. Pritchard sighed. They were such a peculiar pair, weren't they? He so stern and proud, she so fluttery. And yet, there was something between them. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You've heard about the letters?" "Letters, dear?" "Oh, yes. Mrs. Bantry says she saw the Colonel burning some in the fireplace last week, at least that's what her maid told her. But if you ask me, they weren't his letters at all. They were hers." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "How very interesting. I do hope no one has said as much to the inspector. Police minds are so inclined to leap to conclusions, don't you think?" Mrs. Pritchard nodded solemnly. "Oh, yes. And poor Mrs. Frobisher, she's such a nervous thing. I can't imagine her harming anyone. Though..." She hesitated. "It's said she used to be rather close with Major Pickering before she married the Colonel. That might make things awkward." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Awkward," she agreed softly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself at the greengrocer's listening while Mrs. Bantry and Miss Hartnell argued about the proper temperature for baking apple tarts. It was there, quite by chance, that she encountered Inspector Lacey again. He looked harried, as policemen often did in St. Mary Mead, where everyone's helpfulness came at a price. "Good afternoon, Inspector," Miss Marple greeted him cheerfully. "I do hope the village isn't tiring you too much. We're quite a talkative set." He gave her a tired smile. "Talkative is one word for it. I've had 6 different people tell me 6 different versions of the same event. I'm half tempted to arrest the whole village and sort it out afterward." Miss Marple laughed softly. "I shouldn't recommend it. The paperwork would be dreadful." He smiled again, despite himself. "We've learned a bit more, though. The bottle of digitalis. Seems someone took it from the Colonel's cabinet and refilled it with water. We can't prove who yet, but the only one who knew where he kept it was Mrs. Frobisher." "Really?" Miss Marple asked. "And yet, I dare say she wasn't the only one in that house who took an interest in medicine. George Flint, for instance. His mother was a nurse, was she not?" The inspector blinked. "That's right. How did you—" "Oh, one hears things," Miss Marple said mildly. "And I believe he's been caring for that old dog of the Colonel's. Mixing powders in its food. One never knows what small habits people develop when tending to others' ailments." The inspector's brow furrowed. "You think Flint might have known what he was doing?" "Oh, I think people often know far more than they let on. But knowledge and intent are 2 very different matters." She smiled pleasantly. "Paid for, her apples, and left the shop, leaving Inspector Lacey staring after her. That evening, as dusk crept across the village, Miss Marple sat once again by her garden window, knitting untouched in her lap. She was thinking of Mrs. Frobisher's pale face and the faint tremor in her voice, of Major Pickering's exaggerated sympathy, of George Flint's hesitation, and of the quiet detail that seemed to have slipped past everyone else, the Colonel's missing watch chain. He had worn it every day for as long as anyone could remember, yet when his body was found, it was gone. The watch itself lay on his bedside table at home. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People always notice what's gone missing," she murmured to herself. "But they rarely ask why it was taken." The following morning brought rain in earnest, a thin, persistent drizzle that blurred the hedges and turned the orchard path to mud. It also brought Inspector Lacey back to the Frobishers' house, accompanied by a growing sense of certainty. He believed he knew who had done it: Mrs. Frobisher. The case, from his point of view, was simple: opportunity, means, and motive. She had poured the fatal tea herself, had access to her husband's medicine cabinet, and, so it was said, had not been happy for years. A timid, nervous woman could still reach her breaking point, and the inspector had seen enough marriages curdle into bitterness to know the look of it. By 10 o'clock, the inspector had returned to the orchard cottage for what he called a formal statement. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken it upon herself to visit Mrs. Frobisher under the guise of neighborly concern. Mrs. Frobisher's sitting room was dim and faintly perfumed with lavender water. She sat by the fire in a thin wool shawl, her hands twisting a handkerchief to shreds. When Miss Marple was announced, she rose with a start. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. I do hope you don't think—" She stopped, as if the rest of the sentence were too dreadful to speak. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "when one has lived as long as I have, one thinks very little of what people say and rather more of what they mean. Sit down, won't you? I've brought some of my cambric tea, it's quite steadying." The woman obeyed, tears trembling in her eyes. "They think I killed him," she whispered. "They all think it. Even Inspector Lacey looks at me as if he knows." Miss Marple poured the tea, her hands steady. "I don't suppose the inspector has ever been married," she said lightly. "If he had, he might understand that silence between husband and wife can mean many things: resentment, fear, affection, or simple habit. Was your husband ill, Mrs. Frobisher?" The woman nodded. "His heart. He took digitalis every day. I measured it out myself. 1 drop, never more." "How conscientious of you. And yet someone increased the dose?" Mrs. Frobisher's voice trembled. "It wasn't me." "Oh, Miss Marple, I swear it wasn't. He'd been so strange lately, locking himself in the study, writing letters. And then he accused me of something dreadful. Said I'd been unfaithful." "Had you?" Miss Marple's voice was mild, not judgmental. Mrs. Frobisher flushed scarlet. "Before the war, Major Pickering and we were very young. But it was nothing, truly. The Colonel never knew then, but someone must have told him. He said he'd seen a letter." Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly. "A letter? How curious. People rarely burn letters unless they wish to hide their own feelings rather than another's. Did he tell you who showed it to him?" "No," she whispered. "Only that he would deal with the matter in his own way." And the next day, he was dead. When Miss Marple returned home, she found Inspector Lacey waiting outside her gate, looking damp and displeased. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. You've been to see Mrs. Frobisher, I gather." "I have. Poor soul, she's dreadfully overwrought. Quite incapable, I'd say, of measuring poison with such precision." The inspector's jaw tightened. "You'd be surprised what people are capable of when their pride's stung. We found her fingerprints on the bottle, and she's admitted handling it. That's motive and opportunity both." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "Though I wonder, did you find anyone else's fingerprints there?" He frowned. "The maid's, perhaps. She dusted it." Miss Marple nodded absently. "Ah, yes, the maid. Such diligent girls, always tidying up after others. Tell me, Inspector, have you asked Major Pickering where he was after the tea?" "Pickering?" He left early. Said he had a dinner engagement in Melchester. Why? Oh, no reason at all, Miss Marple said with that faintly distracted air that always made policemen uneasy. Only that people rarely leave pleasant company unless something or someone makes them wish to. That evening, the village buzzed with certainty. Mrs. Bantry, of course, declared she'd always suspected poor Mrs. Frobisher. So delicate, you know. Those are the ones you must watch. Miss Hartnell called it a crime of passion, which thrilled her immensely. Even Mr. Pritchard managed a sermon that hinted broadly at domestic deceit. Only Miss Marple seemed untouched by the excitement. She had spent the evening reading quietly by her fire, though now and then she glanced toward the small basket of apples on her table. She selected one, a perfect, glossy fruit, and turned it in her hand, noticing how smooth it looked until one turned it over and saw the tiny bruise beneath. Such lovely surfaces, she murmured. But it's always the blemish that tells the story. Her thoughts wandered back to George Flint, the gardener, his long silences, his hesitation near the orchard, and the faint smell of cider about him. He had known the Colonel's medicines, and he had known his temper, too. And he had been the one to clean up after the apple tea. Poor Mrs. Frobisher, she said softly, setting down the apple. She's caught in a very clever net, but the cleverness, I think, was never hers. The rain passed in the night, leaving behind the fresh, clean scent of wet earth and apples fallen from the trees. St. Mary Mead awoke subdued, its gossip temporarily dampened, as if the village itself sensed that the matter of Colonel Frobisher's death was far from settled. Inspector Lacey had gone to Melchester early, intending to speak with the laboratory about the poison analysis. He left behind a sealed house, a guarded orchard, and a stack of reports that said, on paper, at least, that Mrs. Frobisher was guilty. But Miss Marple, reading the morning paper by her window, had never put much faith in paper evidence. Human nature, she believed, was far more reliable, provided one looked closely enough. It was mid-morning when she decided to walk down to the Frobishers again. She carried a small parcel of scones. It always helps to have a reason, she told herself, and wore her neat gray shawl, the one that made her look rather like a friendly sparrow. George Flint met her at the gate. His cap was pulled low and his boots were thick with mud. "Good morning, Mr. Flint," said Miss Marple cheerfully. "I thought poor Mrs. Frobisher might need something comforting. Such a shock for everyone." "Aye, it's a bad business, miss," he muttered. "Bad business." He made no move to open the gate. Miss Marple peered at him with mild interest. "You've been busy, I see. The orchard looks so tidy considering all the commotion." He shifted uncomfortably. "Inspector said to leave it be, but someone's got to keep it right." Of course, Miss Marple said kindly. "You've always been a hard worker. The Colonel was lucky to have you." He made a strange sound, half scoff, half sigh. "Lucky, was he? Maybe once." And then, realizing he'd said too much, he touched his cap and turned away. Miss Marple watched him go, eyes thoughtful. Then, without fuss, she let herself in through the side gate. Inside the house, Mrs. Frobisher was resting upstairs, the maid said, so Miss Marple sat alone for a moment in the drawing room. The air still smelled faintly of lavender and apples, an oddly sweet combination for a place touched by death. Her gaze wandered across the room, taking in the neat little details, the embroidery on the chair, the china clock on the mantel, the half-burnt logs in the grate. Nothing out of order, except perhaps the writing desk by the window. She rose quietly and looked at it. The drawers were closed, but one corner of a sheet of paper had caught in the seam. Miss Marple hesitated, then gently eased it free. It was an envelope, half-burnt, its edge singed as though rescued from the fire. The handwriting upon it was firm, masculine, and unmistakably that of Colonel Frobisher. "To be opened in the event of my death," it read. Miss Marple's lips tightened. She slipped it back where she had found it just as the maid entered with tea. "Oh, Miss Marple, you gave me a fright," the girl said breathlessly. "Did I, dear? I am so sorry. I was just admiring this handsome desk. Such craftsmanship one rarely sees now." The maid smiled weakly. Colonel's pride, that was. "Always locking it, too. Said there were private papers." "How sensible of him," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "It's so easy for letters to fall into the wrong hands. I remember once in St. Mary Mead, a young man nearly lost his position over a letter never meant to be read at all. It caused quite the stir. The maid brightened immediately, curiosity piqued. "Really, ma'am?" "What happened?" "Oh," Miss Marple said lightly. "Someone copied the handwriting, you see. A very neat forgery. Good enough to deceive anyone not accustomed to details. One must be terribly careful about imitating a hand. Even the most practiced forger forgets that emotion leaves traces ink never can." She smiled benignly, but her eyes were thoughtful as she sipped her tea. That afternoon, Miss Marple called on Inspector Lacey. He was surprised to see her waiting outside the station with her knitting bag and umbrella. "Good heavens. Miss Marple, have you come to offer your verdict?" "Not at all," she said, smiling. "Only a thought or two? I happened upon something in Mrs. Frobisher's sitting room. A letter, partly burned. Seemed rather deliberate to me. If you were to examine it, I dare say you'd find the writing worth comparing to the Colonel's usual hand. There's a sharpness in the loops that doesn't match." Lacey frowned. "You think it's a forgery?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that someone wished the Colonel to believe his wife unfaithful and chose a letter to make it so. A cruel trick, effective too, and it would explain why a man in otherwise fair health might suddenly become difficult." The inspector stared. "If that's true, then whoever forged that letter started all this." "Quite so," said Miss Marple, gathering her shawl. "And I would look, if I were you, for someone with neat hands, accustomed to careful work, someone who might handle a pen as deftly as a spade." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the letter's image lingering in her mind. A forgery meant deceit. Deceit meant motive, and there were very few in St. Mary Mead who could both write so neatly and know the Frobishers well enough to exploit their secrets. George Flint had once been the Colonel's orderly, years ago. He had written his reports, kept his records, even managed his correspondence. He would know the man's hand as well as any secretary. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "Dear me," she murmured. "How strange the way bitterness ripens, just like an apple left too long on the branch." The next day dawned brighter, deceptively peaceful, with sunlight falling over the neat hedges and thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead. But within the tidy walls of the village, tension rippled beneath every polite exchange. The gossip, though quieter, had grown sharper, no longer idle speculation, but something darker tinged with fear. Miss Marple, who never trafficked in gossip but understood it as one might study weather patterns, knew what the shift meant. People were starting to suspect one another. That, she thought, was when truth usually began to show its face, when fear loosened tongues more effectively than curiosity ever could. It began at the grocer's. Mrs. Bantry, flushed and full of inside knowledge, had cornered poor Alice Pritchard near the scales. "I tell you, my dear Inspector Lacey's nearly ready to arrest her. They found notes in Mrs. Frobisher's handwriting, letters to Major Pickering." "Absolutely scandalous," Alice gasped, dropping her basket of apples. "Oh, heavens." But surely she couldn't. "Well," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice but not her volume, "we all thought her a bit weak and fluttery. But those are the very sort, aren't they? Still waters and all that." From her place near the tinned goods, Miss Marple sighed softly. "My dear Mrs. Bantry," she said, stepping forward, "you mustn't believe everything you hear. Handwriting can be a treacherous thing, rather like character. One may recognize the shape, yet not the substance." Mrs. Bantry pursed her lips. "You mean it's false?" "I mean," said Miss Marple kindly, "that appearances are nearly always more clever than people give them credit for." That afternoon, Inspector Lacey appeared at Miss Marple's gate once more. He looked less confident than before. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. You were right about the letter. It's a forgery. The lab found 2 different inks used. Whoever did it tried to imitate the Colonel's hand. But under magnification you can see the hesitation marks. Someone practiced." Miss Marple nodded. "That would take patience, wouldn't it? And a steady hand. Someone used to careful detail and perhaps not overly scrupulous about deception." The inspector frowned. "You think Flint?" "Possibly," she said. "But one must always be certain of motive, Inspector. Poisoning isn't a rash act, it's a waiting crime. It's done by someone who knows they'll have the opportunity and the time to see it through." Lacey leaned against the fence. "If you're right about the forgery, maybe the whole thing started with blackmail. Flint could have written the letter, showed it to the Colonel, made him believe his wife was unfaithful, and then, when the Colonel found out, things got ugly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. That's quite possible, though I do wonder what became of the Colonel's watch chain. The inspector blinked. The watch chain? Yes, she said mildly. The one missing when he was found. A man like the Colonel would never misplace it. It would have been as much a part of him as his temper. Such small things, Inspector, often carry large truths. Later that evening, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the orchard. The police tape still fluttered between the trees, but the constable on duty, a nervous young man, let her through without protest. "Mind your step, ma'am," he said. The air was heavy with the scent of fallen fruit. The grass beneath the great apple tree had been trampled by boots, but the place still held its strange calm. She paused, looking down at the roots where the Colonel's body had been found. There, half buried in the mud, something glinted faintly in the slanting light. She bent down. It was a link of gold, small, curved, unmistakably from a watch chain, but it was bent, twisted as though torn violently. Miss Marple slipped it into her handkerchief and straightened slowly, eyes narrowing in thought. She heard a sound behind her, a rustle, a quick intake of breath, and turned to see George Flint standing a few paces away, his face pale, eyes darting. "Didn't mean to startle you." "Miss," he said hoarsely. "Just checking the fence." "How very diligent," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "It's a good thing someone looks after the Colonel's property." He nodded stiffly. "Aye, someone ought to." She regarded him a moment longer, then said softly, "It must be difficult tending a place where such a thing happened." "One might start to feel watched." Flint's jaw tightened. "I've nothing to hide." "Of course not," Miss Marple said kindly. "But it's curious, isn't it? The way things remain, small things. Broken pieces that tell the rest of the story. You'd be surprised what a gold link can say if one listens." His eyes flicked down to her hand where she still held the handkerchief, then back to her face. For the briefest instant, something, fear or guilt or anger, passed through them, and then he turned on his heel and walked swiftly away. That night, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, she took the gold link from its wrapping and set it on the table beside her tea. She studied it in silence. It was clean, but the break was rough. Not the sort of neat repair a gentleman would make, but the result of a wrenching pull. A struggle, then. Not a calm poisoning after all, but something that turned suddenly desperate. She glanced toward her window, where the orchard lights flickered in the distance. "Yes," she murmured. He must have known, or guessed, and that was his undoing. Her knitting lay untouched as she poured another cup of tea, her expression calm but her eyes alive with thought. "Poor Inspector Lacey," she said softly. "He sees hands and bottles and fingerprints, but he doesn't see pride, and pride in this village kills far more efficiently than poison." The following morning brought rain, a slow, steady drizzle that seemed to soften the outlines of St. Mary Mead. Roofs gleamed wetly, and the cobbled lanes shone like mirrors. Miss Marple always thought rain had a cleansing quality, but that morning, the village air felt heavier than ever. Word spread quickly. There had been another incident. At 7:30, Mr. Flint was found collapsed in the tool shed behind the Frobishers' orchard, unconscious but alive. A bottle of spirits lay beside him, half drained, the rest spilled into the soil. Some said it was drink, others whispered it wasn't. Inspector Lacey stood outside the shed, rain dripping off his hat brim, as Miss Marple approached with her umbrella. "Miss Marple," he said grimly, "seems your Mr. Flint got himself into trouble. Either he tried to drink his guilt away or someone decided to shut him up for good." Miss Marple peered into the dim shed. Flint lay on a cot, breathing raggedly, his skin pale and waxy. "And has the doctor been?" "On his way. But there's something you ought to see." He motioned toward the workbench. There, half buried beneath a heap of rags, lay a leather-bound book, its pages stained but still legible. Miss Marple stepped closer. The book was an accounts ledger, dated 2 years back. Lacey flipped it open. "Look here. Colonel Frobisher's signature, week after week. Payments to Flint, but not for wages. Consulting fee, special errands, delivery discretion. Looks like hush money." Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly over the inked lines. Indeed, and also neatly recorded. Not the Colonel's way at all. He preferred receipts to honesty. "I rather think Mr. Flint kept this. For safety. Meaning blackmail?" She nodded gently. "Or leverage, at least. Men like Mr. Flint have a fine instinct for survival, but it seems this time he misjudged the strength of his hand. By noon, the doctor had confirmed it. Flint had been poisoned with a heavy dose of sleeping draught. Not enough to kill, but enough to keep him silent for a time. The same compound, incidentally, that had killed Colonel Frobisher. The village was buzzing anew. If Flint hadn't been the murderer, then someone had tried to silence him. Someone who knew what he knew. Mrs. Price, the maid, was pale and trembling when questioned. He'd been asking after papers, she stammered. Said he'd hidden something. Kept saying she won't get away with it, he did. She? Repeated Inspector Lacey sharply. Who's she? But Mrs. Price only shook her head helplessly. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, looked up from her knitting. Sometimes, she said softly, when people speak of she, they don't mean one person, but the idea of a person. The one who wronged them or the one who reminded them of it. The guilty conscience can get its pronouns rather tangled. Lacey frowned. Meaning you think he wasn't talking about Mrs. Frobisher? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. I think Mr. Flint's sense of justice was emotional, not logical, and emotional men often seek punishment, not truth. That evening, Miss Marple paid a call to Mrs. Frobisher, who was sitting alone in the drawing room, the fire low, her teacup trembling slightly in her hand. They say Flint's alive, she said softly before Miss Marple could speak. Thank heaven. It's a terrible thing to wish death on a man, even when one believes him capable of terrible deeds. Miss Marple took a seat. Forgiveness, my dear, is a kind of intelligence most people never master. Though it's curious, your maid mentioned Mr. Flint had been looking for papers. Do you know of any such thing? Mrs. Frobisher's fingers tightened on her cup. Papers? No. My husband was fond of keeping records, letters, accounts, but I destroyed most after the funeral. How prudent of you, Miss Marple said mildly. One mustn't let ghosts linger in drawers. A silence stretched between them. Then very quietly, Miss Marple said, You must have known about the payments, of course. Mrs. Frobisher looked up sharply. Payments? The ledger, my dear. Inspector Lacey has it now. Rather incriminating, I should think, unless properly explained. Her eyes widened, color draining from her face. I know that's impossible. Those were meant to... She stopped herself, breath catching. To what? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Frobisher pressed her hand to her mouth. Oh, God forgive me, she whispered. He was threatening me. Flint. He said he'd tell everyone that I knew about my husband's affairs. He said people would think I had reason to hate him. And did you? Tears welled in her eyes. I pitied him, Miss Marple, truly. But pity doesn't stop anger. When a man humiliates you long enough, anger becomes the only thing that feels honest. Miss Marple reached over, laying a gentle hand on hers. You poor child. But anger, even when deserved, can make one very careless. I hope you weren't so unwise as to confront him that night. Mrs. Frobisher's lips trembled. No, not him. I only wanted to frighten Flint. I poured a few drops of the draught into his flask that morning, just to make him ill enough to stop tormenting me. I didn't mean to. Miss Marple sighed softly. Intentions, my dear, are seldom the measure of guilt. But it seems we are looking for someone else entirely. That night, as she walked home through the wet lanes, Miss Marple's thoughts moved swiftly. 2 poisonings, one fatal, one mercifully not. The same substance, and both tied to the same small circle. No, not Mrs. Frobisher. She was too timid, too fearful. And Flint, for all his greed, had been more blackmailer than murderer. Then who had the patience, the cunning, and the motive to silence both? Her eyes narrowed as she reached her gate. Yes, she murmured. It fits rather too well. A quiet revenge hidden beneath loyalty. The one person no one would suspect. She glanced toward the vicarage, where a faint light still burned in the study window. The friend who poured the tea. It was one of those afternoons when St. Mary Mead looked almost too peaceful. The air still. The roads damp from the night's rain, and the smell of apples and earth drifting through open windows. To any passer-by, it was a scene of perfect English calm. But beneath it, the village was holding its breath. Colonel Frobisher's death had changed something subtle yet lasting. The villagers spoke in lowered tones. Laughter came with hesitation. The vicar's wife no longer held her teas, and the postmistress now sorted the mail as though each letter might explode. And through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlor, knitting a pair of blue mittens no one had asked for, her thoughts turning and turning like the hands of a clock waiting for the hour to strike. Inspector Lacey arrived just past 4. "Miss Marple," he began, not even bothering to remove his hat. "We've questioned everyone twice over. The Frobisher woman's confession clears her of the Colonel's murder. She admits to dosing Flint and the timeline matches. But that still leaves the Colonel's killer. And now the doctor says Flint may not live to name names." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "A pity. I rather liked Mr. Flint. Brutal, of course, but not clever enough to manage such neat cruelty." The inspector frowned. "You mean the poison?" "Yes," she said, folding her hands neatly. "Too measured. Too precise. A man like Flint would have used a hammer, not a tincture bottle." Lacey gave a weary sigh. "So who did then?" "Everyone in that orchard had reason enough. Money, jealousy, or pride." "Not quite everyone," Miss Marple murmured.
"Some people act from loyalty."
"And that, Inspector, is the most dangerous motive of all." He stared at her, puzzled. "Loyalty?" She smiled faintly. "Yes, the sort that defends reputation long after love is dead. The kind that will tidy away a scandal with a calm hand and a clean conscience." An hour later, Miss Marple's cottage was set for tea. The rain had returned in a whispering drizzle, pattering softly against the window panes. On her little table, the good china was laid out. Rose-patterned cups, a plate of seed cake, and a fresh pot of Darjeeling steaming gently beside the tray. At precisely 5:30, there came a knock. "Come in, my dear," she called. Mrs. Lacey entered, the inspector's wife. Her pleasant, capable face was a little pale, her hat slightly askew from the rain. "You sent word you wished to see me, Miss Marple?" "Yes, indeed," said Miss Marple warmly. "I do so appreciate your help with the church raffle, and I thought a little tea would do us both good." Mrs. Lacey smiled politely, setting her gloves aside. "It's kind of you to say so, though I must admit I've scarcely thought of raffles since this dreadful business began. Poor Colonel Frobisher, and poor Mrs. Frobisher too." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, pouring the tea. "People do dreadful things for love and for shame." Mrs. Lacey's hands paused on the saucer. "Shame?" "Oh yes," said Miss Marple lightly. "I dare say you know more than most how reputation matters in a village like ours. The wrong kind of gossip can undo years of respectability. And some ladies, well, some might go to great lengths to prevent that." Mrs. Lacey gave a small, controlled laugh. "Surely you're not suggesting I—" "Not at all," said Miss Marple gently. "I only wonder how difficult it must have been for you, knowing the Colonel was on the verge of being exposed for blackmail and deceit. It must have seemed so untidy." The smile faded from Mrs. Lacey's lips. Miss Marple continued almost conversationally. "You see, I've known for some time that the tea served in the orchard that day wasn't brewed by the Frobisher's maid, as everyone assumed. She was seen at the post office just before the gathering. No, the person who poured the Colonel's cup, who sweetened it for him, in fact, was you." Mrs. Lacey's eyes widened. "That's absurd." "Not at all," Miss Marple said mildly. "You've always taken great care with your husband's work, always near the center of any village matter and quite trusted by everyone. You had access to the inspector's notes, didn't you? You would have known precisely which poison had been locked in the evidence cabinet last spring. The very same compound used on the Colonel." There was silence. The only sound was the slow ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Lacey's hands trembled slightly as she set her cup down. You think I murdered him?" she whispered. Miss Marple smiled, the expression kind but unyielding. "I think you sought to protect your husband's good name, my dear. Flint was blackmailing the Colonel, but the Colonel had been blackmailing someone else. Your husband. About the evidence tampered with in last year's burglary case. Oh, I do listen when people speak at church socials." Mrs. Lacey's breath came in shallow gasps. "He made such a stupid mistake, just one. And that man, Frobisher, would have ruined us both. I only meant to make him ill, frighten him off. But he took 2 cups. I didn't think—" Her voice broke. Miss Marple's tone softened. "People rarely do when love and desperation combine. But when Flint began to suspect you, you had no choice but to silence him as well. A pity you didn't measure the dose quite as accurately the second time." Tears slid down Mrs. Lacey's cheeks. "Please," she whispered. "You'll destroy Henry. He doesn't know. He never knew." Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression almost sorrowful. "My dear, it isn't I who will destroy him. Truth has a way of revealing itself, whether we wish it to or not." At that moment the door opened. Inspector Lacey stood there, pale and stunned, having heard enough. He removed his hat slowly. "Mary," he said hoarsely, "what have you done?" Mrs. Lacey bowed her head, her sobs muffled against her hands. Miss Marple stepped back quietly, her eyes distant. "I believe, Inspector," she said softly. "You'll find the vial in her sewing box, the blue one with the broken clasp." That night, St. Mary Mead was silent again. Rain washed the lanes clean, and the orchard beyond the Frobishers' gate stood dark and still beneath the moonlight. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. She was thinking of Mrs. Lacey, not with judgment, but with that melancholy understanding that came only from age and long observation. "So much trouble," she murmured, from a little cup of tea. After a moment, she poured herself another, added 1 lump of sugar, and took a slow, thoughtful sip. "People are really very much the same everywhere," she said softly, "even here." The next morning broke gray and still over St. Mary Mead, the kind of morning that seems to pause between storms. A hush lay over the village, a quiet born of both disbelief and exhaustion. Everyone knew by now what had happened in Miss Marple's parlor the evening before. Mrs. Lacey had been taken away in the inspector's car, her pale face hidden behind a shawl. No one had seen the inspector since. The vicar's wife was seen crying near the churchyard gate. Mrs. Bantry, of course, had already told the butcher, the baker, and half the parish that Miss Marple had solved the whole affair single-handedly. But Miss Marple herself sat very still in her drawing room, a faint sadness about her as she sorted her knitting basket. It was not triumph she felt, only that familiar melancholy of a woman who has seen too often what people will do for pride, and what pride will do to people. Inspector Lacey arrived just after 10. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue, his mouth set in a grim line. "I've come to thank you," he said quietly, "and to understand, if you don't mind. I can't quite make sense of it all." Miss Marple motioned to the chair by the window. "Of course, Inspector, sit down. You look very tired," he sat, rubbing his forehead. "I suppose I should start with the obvious question. How did you know it was her?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I didn't know, not at first. I only listened and watched. People always reveal themselves in their silences." She poured 2 cups of tea, one for him, one for herself, and began as though recounting a simple domestic tale. "You see, Colonel Frobisher was not merely an unpleasant man. He was dangerous in a quieter way. He held secrets, and everyone's secrets, and he kept them as carefully as a miser keeps coins. Flint thought himself a clever blackmailer, but the colonel was his master in that trade. He had discovered something that could have ruined you, Inspector. Your little indiscretion with the evidence in the burglary case. Your wife knew. And being a loyal and practical woman, she took it upon herself to tidy matters." Lacey's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "She did it cleverly," Miss Marple went on gently. "She offered to help Mrs. Frobisher serve tea during the garden gathering. Everyone assumed she was simply being kind. She poured the colonel's cup herself, and since she was the inspector's wife, who would suspect her of meddling with poison? But alas, Mrs. Frobisher had already poured a smaller amount of the same draught into the colonel's whiskey earlier that morning, hoping only to make him ill. The combination proved fatal. That, Inspector, is why your wife truly believed she had only made him ill, until Flint began to hint otherwise. He knew too much, and she could not risk him talking. So she arranged a second dose. But panic, not precision, ruled her then. The amount she gave him merely put him to sleep." Lacey swallowed hard, staring into his untouched tea.
"And the gold watch chain?"
"Ah, yes," Miss Marple said softly. "That was the final piece. It was broken during a brief struggle. The colonel must have realized something was wrong. When he fell, someone, perhaps your wife, perhaps another, tried to straighten his collar. But the link fell among the roots. It was not meant to be found. And so the story told itself backward. Flint's blackmail, Mrs. Frobisher's fear, your wife's misplaced loyalty. 3 people poisoned by love, shame, and pride, though only one by the draught. There was silence for a long while. The rain began again, faintly tapping against the window panes. At last Lacey spoke, his voice low and uneven. "She said she did it for me, to protect me. I never asked her to." Miss Marple looked at him with quiet sympathy. "No, but love doesn't always wait to be asked, Inspector. It imagines what must be done, and then does it for better or worse." He nodded, staring at his hands. "She'll hang for it." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said softly. There was no malice in her act, only fear. The courts are not blind to such things. He rose, his shoulders heavy. "You're very kind, Miss Marple." "Not kind," she corrected gently. "Only observant, and rather too old to be surprised by human nature." That afternoon the sky cleared. Sunlight spilled across the wet hedges and glistened on the cobbles. Children were heard laughing again in the lanes, their shouts echoing off the church walls. Life in St. Mary Mead, as always, began to return to its habitual rhythm, the gossip mellowing into recollection, the scandal softening into story. Miss Marple, sitting in her garden among the roses, took up her knitting once more. A thrush sang somewhere beyond the hedge. The bees hummed lazily around the lavender. She smiled faintly to herself. "Strange," she murmured, "how evil so often hides in kindness, and kindness in turn brings it to light. It's all rather like gardening, really. You never know what's growing beneath the soil until the roots are disturbed." She looked up at the apple tree beyond her gate, the same one where the whole sad affair had begun. The last of its blossoms had fallen now, scattered like pale secrets across the grass. And for a moment, just before she went back inside, Miss Marple thought she heard it again, a faint rustle, like a whisper beneath the branches. Only the wind, of course. But then, Miss Marple always did believe that places remembered things. It was nearly a fortnight before St. Mary Mead resembled itself again. The market stalls returned to the square. Mrs. Bantry resumed her brisk morning walks, and even the vicar's wife began holding small teas for charity, though everyone knew they were really for the exchange of the latest whispers. The Frobisher house stood empty. Its once proud garden had gone slightly to seed, the gates locked and the orchard left to quiet decay. Only the bees seemed undisturbed, buzzing faithfully among the last of the fallen apples. From her own garden, Miss Marple could see the top of the old apple tree. Its branches were bare now, stripped by the autumn wind, but it still had that calm, watchful air that made her think of secrets. She found it oddly comforting. Mrs. Price, the maid, came by one afternoon to bring Miss Marple a jar of plum jam and to talk, as people often did, more than they intended. "It's such a pity." "Ma'am," she said, twisting her handkerchief. "Mrs. Lacey always seemed so good and kind. I can't think how she could ever do a thing like that." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Kindness, my dear, is often a disguise we wear for what we wish to be. Sometimes it hides goodness, sometimes guilt, but one must never be too quick to judge which is which." Mrs. Price sighed. "And the poor inspector. He's gone to stay with his brother in Bath, they say. Can't face the village." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "He'll find it quieter there." She thanked the girl for the jam and watched her go, her sturdy figure retreating down the lane. Then Miss Marple settled herself by the window with her knitting once more, though her needles lay idle in her lap. That evening the sky burned red over the fields, and the sound of the church bells drifted faintly through the air. Miss Marple sat with a cup of cocoa, thinking, not of guilt or innocence, but of the curious frailty of all human motives. She thought of Mrs. Frobisher, now gone to live with a cousin in Devon, her reputation bruised but her conscience finally clear. Of poor George Flint, who had survived but whose days of scheming were done. Of Mrs. Lacey awaiting trial with quiet dignity, and of the inspector walking alone in some quiet street in Bath, burdened not by disgrace, but by sorrow. No one, Miss Marple reflected, had truly won. That was the way of such stories. Justice was a complicated thing, never clean, never simple, but necessary all the same. The following Sunday, Miss Marple went to church as usual. The sermon was on forgiveness, a virtue, the vicar said, that requires both courage and humility. Miss Marple listened, her expression serene, her thoughts elsewhere. When the service ended, she lingered in the porch speaking gently with a few of the villagers. The conversation, as it always did, drifted toward the recent tragedy. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," said Mr. Weatherby, the grocer. "But thank heaven it's all over now. Can't abide such wickedness in a place like ours." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear Mr. Weatherby," she said kindly. "Wickedness doesn't come from places. It comes from people. And people, I'm afraid, are much the same wherever one goes." He chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether she was joking, and she patted his arm. That night, After the lamps were out and the village had gone quiet, Miss Marple stood for a moment by her open window. The air smelled faintly of rain and apples, and the distant hoot of an owl carried through the stillness. She looked out toward the orchard once more, that solemn patch of ground that had seen so much of pride and folly. In the moonlight, it looked quite peaceful again. Her eyes softened. "Poor Mary Lacey," she murmured. She thought she could prune away wickedness as one does a dead branch. But human hearts are not so easily tended. They always grow back in curious directions. She drew the curtain and turned toward bed, her slippers whispering across the floorboards. On the small table beside her chair lay her knitting, the blue mittens now complete. She folded them carefully and smiled as if at some private recollection. "Still," she said quietly, "it's a comfort to see things set right even if only for a time." Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the apple tree, and the village of St. Mary Mead slept once more, beneath the same calm sky that had watched its tragedies for 100 years. And Miss Marple, ever gentle, ever observant, closed her eyes knowing that tomorrow would bring another cup of tea, another polite conversation, and perhaps, someday soon, another whisper beneath the apple tree. If you enjoyed Whispers Beneath the Apple Tree, leave a comment so we know you've uncovered the truth with Miss Marple. Subscribe for more timeless mysteries, where every teacup hides a secret and every whisper tells a story. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your tea warm.